The sky above the Philippine Sea, the 19th of June, 1944, 0830 hours, Philippine Sea, Western Pacific. The sun climbed slowly over an ocean that stretched endlessly in every direction, its surface catching light like hammered steel. Beneath that vast expanse of blue, the Imperial Japanese Navy's first mobile fleet cut through the water with the confidence of emperors. Aboard the carrier, Taiho, flight deck crews in white uniforms moved with practiced precision, fueling Mitsubishi Zeros and arming Nakajima torpedo bombers. The smell of aviation gasoline mixed with salt air. Metal clanged against metal. Officers barked orders that echoed across the deck. These men had trained for this moment, the decisive battle that would break American resolve and secure Japan's dominion over the Pacific. They had been told, repeatedly, that their spirit, their Yamato Damashi, would overcome any material disadvantage. They believed it with the fervor of the faithful. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of his flagship, studying intelligence reports that painted an optimistic picture. The Americans were somewhere to the east, their carrier task forces vulnerable, their pilots inexperienced compared to Japan's veteran aviators. This would be the battle that avenged Midway, that restored honor, that proved Japanese naval aviation remained supreme. The plans were meticulous. The approach was textbook. Everything that could be controlled had been controlled. What could not be controlled was what the Americans had become. For 3 years, since that December morning when Japanese aircraft had torn through the dawn over Pearl Harbor, the United States had transformed itself into something unprecedented in human history, an industrial colossus that turned raw materials into weapons at a pace that defied comprehension. In shipyards from Virginia to California, welders worked around the clock. In factories across the Midwest, women who had never held tools now assembled aircraft with assembly line efficiency that would have seemed impossible before the war. The America that Japan had attacked in 1941 was not the America that now prowled the Pacific in 1944, but Japanese military planners, isolated by censorship and blinded by ideology, could not grasp the scale of what they faced. Among the weapons that would shatter their assumptions that morning was an aircraft they had never encountered in significant numbers, the Grumman TBF Avenger, a torpedo bomber that represented everything about American industrial might that Japanese strategists had failed to understand. The Avenger was not elegant. It was not a philosopher's weapon or a poet's dream. It was a blunt instrument of war, built by a nation that had learned to manufacture violence with the same efficiency it once produced automobiles. 3 men crewed each aircraft pilot, turret gunner, and radioman bombardier, seated in a fuselage that seemed too large, too heavy, too brutish to perform the delicate dance of carrier aviation. Yet the Avenger carried a torpedo that weighed more than a ton, or 4 500-pound bombs, or depth charges, and it carried them farther and faster than any comparable Japanese aircraft. Its radial engine, a 14-cylinder Cyclone that generated 1,900 horsepower, pulled the aircraft through the sky with remorseless power. Everything about the Avenger was excessive by Japanese standards, wasteful even, a machine that required tremendous resources to build and operate. But America had tremendous resources. Japanese pilots, raised in a military culture that glorified austerity and spiritual strength, could not reconcile the mathematics of American production with their understanding of warfare. They had been taught that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that 10 Japanese were worth 100 Americans, that the soft, decadent West would crumble before the hardened sons of Nippon. These beliefs were not mere propaganda. They were woven into the fabric of military training, reinforced by officers who had never seen an American factory, never witnessed the grotesque abundance of a nation that had spent the 1,930 seconds perfecting mass production and now applied those techniques to instruments of death. In the months before the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese pilots stationed across the Pacific had begun to encounter the Avenger in growing numbers. The reports they filed were fragmentary, confused, often contradictory. The aircraft was slow compared to fighters, vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, an easy target for a skilled Zero pilot. Yet the Avengers kept coming. Shot down over Rabaul in November 1943, they appeared again in January 1944. Decimated over Truk in February, they returned in greater numbers in April. Each wave seemed larger than the last. Each squadron seemed better trained, better coordinated, better equipped with technology that Japanese forces could not match. What the Japanese pilots did not understand, what their commanders could not explain, was that the United States was building aircraft carriers faster than Japan could sink them, training pilots faster than combat could kill them, producing torpedoes and bombs faster than they could be dropped. In 1943 alone, American shipyards launched 50 aircraft carriers of various classes. 50. Japan, straining every resource, struggling to replace losses from earlier battles, managed to complete 4. The numbers were so lopsided they seemed like clerical errors. The Avenger embodied this disparity. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, operating from factories on Long Island, produced 9,839 Avengers between 1,942 and 1,945. General Motors, converting automobile plants to aircraft production, built thousands more under license. The aircraft that Japanese pilots shot down one month were replaced by dozens the next. It was a kind of warfare that Japan, for all its martial tradition and tactical brilliance, had never imagined warfare as manufacturing problem, combat as logistics equation, victory measured not in courage but in output per man-hour. On the morning of June 19, as Vice Admiral Ozawa prepared to launch his strike, he commanded 9 aircraft carriers and 473 carrier-based aircraft. He did not know that the Americans, steaming toward him from the east, had 15 carriers and more than 900 aircraft. He did not know that American submarines had already torpedoed 2 of his oil tankers, leaving his fleet desperately short of fuel. He did not know that American codebreakers had been reading Japanese naval communications for months, that American radar could detect his aircraft at ranges his own technology could not match, that American damage control training and equipment had advanced to the point where ships that would have sunk in 1942 could now absorb tremendous punishment and remain operational. He did not know that he was about to fight a battle his side could not win, against an enemy whose true strength remained hidden behind an ocean and a continent and a productive capacity that defied understanding. The first wave of Japanese aircraft launched at 0830. 83 fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes rose from the decks of Ozawa's carriers and formed up, heading east toward the American task force. Pilots checked their instruments, adjusted their oxygen masks, felt the familiar weight of their flight suits. Some of them had fought at Pearl Harbor, at Coral Sea, at Midway. They were veterans, skilled and experienced. They flew toward the enemy with confidence born of training and tradition. They flew toward a wall of American fighters that had been vectored to intercept them by radar systems the Japanese did not possess. The battle that would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot began with shocking violence. American F-6F Hellcats, guided by radar controllers aboard the carriers, tore into the Japanese formations with a ferocity that stunned the attackers. The Hellcat was another product of American XS, a fighter built to be fast, rugged, heavily armed, and producible in vast quantities. Grumman designed it with lessons learned from earlier combats, incorporating pilot feedback, armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and firepower that Japanese aircraft could not match. 6. 50-caliber machine guns, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, could shred the light, unarmored airframes of Japanese fighters and bombers. The Japanese had expected fierce resistance. They had not expected annihilation. Within minutes, the carefully formed strike formations disintegrated into chaos. Zeros fell burning into the sea. Nakajima bombers, slow and vulnerable, died by the dozens. Of the 83 aircraft in the first wave, fewer than half reached the American fleet, and those that did faced a second shock. A curtain of anti-aircraft fire so dense it seemed to physicalize the air itself. The Americans had developed proximity-fused shells that exploded near aircraft without requiring direct hits, creating expanding spheres of shrapnel that killed with mathematical efficiency. Aboard the American carriers and battleships, Hundreds of 40mm Bofors guns and 20mm Oerlikon cannons tracked targets, their barrels traversing smoothly on powered mounts, their crews trained to saturation point. The Japanese had encountered American anti-aircraft fire before, but never at this volume, never with this coordination. Shells burst in patterns, overlapping fields of fire that left no safe approach. Pilots who had survived years of combat found themselves trapped in 3 dimensions of death, unable to climb above it, unable to dive below it, unable to turn away fast enough to escape. Some dropped their torpedoes at extreme range and fled. Others pressed attacks with suicidal determination and died within sight of their targets. A handful landed hits a bomb on the battleship South Dakota, minor damage to a few other ships, but the American formation steamed on, barely slowed, its carriers untouched and operational. Aboard Tai-Ho, confusion reigned. Radio reports were fragmentary, contradictory. Some pilots reported successful attacks, others screamed warnings about overwhelming fighter opposition. The tactical situation made no sense through the lens of Japanese expectations. How could the Americans have so many fighters in the air simultaneously? How could they coordinate intercepts so effectively? Where were all these aircraft coming from? The answer was steaming in the American task force, 15 carriers, each capable of launching and recovering aircraft with a speed and efficiency that Japanese carriers could not match. American deck crews, trained in rapid-fire launch and recovery procedures, could cycle aircraft faster than their Japanese counterparts. American logistics allowed for more spare parts, more fuel, more ammunition. American damage control meant that even wounded carriers could continue operations. Every aspect of the American system multiplied force, while every aspect of the Japanese system, strained by years of war, depleted of resources, isolated from technological advances, subtracted capability. The second Japanese strike wave launched at 0900, larger than the first 128 aircraft. They met the same wall of Hellcats, the same curtain of anti-aircraft fire, the same systematic destruction. The third wave, launched around noon, suffered even worse losses. By mid-afternoon, Japanese carrier aviation had been gutted. Of the 473 aircraft Ozawa had started the day with, more than 350 were gone, shot down, crashed, or so badly damaged they could not fight effectively. The Japanese pilots who survived and made it back to their carriers told stories that their commanders struggled to believe. They described American formations so large they darkened the sky. They spoke of American fighters that seemed to be everywhere simultaneously, diving from advantageous positions, working in coordinated pairs, never making the tactical errors that Japanese pilots had been trained to exploit. They reported American gunfire that created walls of steel through which no aircraft could pass. These were not the reports of cowards or incompetents, these were veteran aviators, men who had faced death repeatedly and survived through skill and reflexes. Their testimonies carried weight precisely because they came from men who understood aerial combat intimately, but the day's disasters were not finished. At 1532, the submarine USS Albacore, operating submerged near the Japanese fleet, fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at a large carrier. Commander James Blanchard, peering through his periscope, watched as one torpedo struck the Tai-Ho on the starboard side, just below the waterline. The explosion was not immediately catastrophic. The carrier's damage control parties believed they had contained the flooding, believed the ship would survive. But the torpedo had ruptured aviation fuel tanks, and gasoline vapors began to spread through the ship's interior spaces. At 1530, nearly 3 hours after the initial hit, those vapors found an ignition source. The explosion that followed tore Tai-Ho apart from within. Fires spread with impossible speed. Secondary explosions ripped through fuel and ammunition stores. By 1632, the carrier Ozawa's flagship, the pride of the combined fleet, was sinking, taking 1,650 men with her into the dark water. The submarine USS Kavala torpedoed and sank the carrier Shokaku that afternoon. A third carrier, Hio, would be lost the following day to American carrier aircraft. The Battle of the Philippine Sea lasted 2 days and ended Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. Japan lost 3 fleet carriers and more than 600 aircraft, including the majority of her trained carrier pilots. The Americans lost 123 aircraft and suffered minor damage to several ships. No American carriers were sunk or seriously damaged. It was not a battle. It was an execution. But this accounting of ships and aircraft and casualties does not capture what the Japanese pilots experienced in those 2 days. The psychological trauma of encountering an enemy who fought with resources that seemed limitless, who replaced losses faster than they could be inflicted, who improved with every engagement while Japanese forces deteriorated. The pilots who survived the Philippine Sea returned to carriers that could barely operate, to squadrons that existed only on paper, to an empire that was running out of fuel, out of aluminum, out of time. The Avenger, which had launched from American carriers that morning as part of combat air patrols and defensive screens, would play an even more prominent role in the closing phases of the Pacific War. On June 20, as American forces pursued the retreating Japanese fleet, Avengers participated in the long-range strike that damaged several more Japanese carriers and oilers. The attack required American aircraft to fly to the limits of their range, knowing they would have to return in darkness with fuel tanks nearly empty. Pilots launched, knowing some would not make it back. They launched anyway, because American doctrine emphasized aggressive action, because American carriers had recovery systems sophisticated enough to handle night operations, because American destroyer screens were trained to pick up ditched pilots, because the entire system was designed to support maximum operational tempo. That evening, as exhausted American pilots struggled to find their carriers in the darkness, many ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. The carriers turned on their lights, a tremendous risk in submarine-infested waters, to guide pilots home. Destroyers crisscrossed the sea, rescuing ditched aircrews. Of the 216 pilots and aircrew who flew that mission, 209 survived. In the Japanese fleet, such losses would have been catastrophic and unrecoverable. In the American fleet, they were a temporary setback, mourned but absorbed. The lost aircraft replaced within weeks, the squadrons made whole again, with new pilots and new machines flowing from an industrial base that seemed inexhaustible. Japanese pilots who encountered Avengers in the final year of the Pacific War described a kind of despair that went beyond tactical defeat. They spoke of American formations that operated with clockwork precision, torpedo bombers that pressed attacks through walls of anti-aircraft fire, escort fighters that never seemed to run low on ammunition or fuel. They described American aircraft that kept coming, kept attacking, kept appearing in greater numbers no matter how many were shot down. This was psychological warfare of a particular kind, the warfare of abundance against scarcity, of industrial power against martial tradition, of a system that could afford to lose machines because it could build more faster than the enemy could destroy them. The recurring symbol in Japanese accounts from this period is fuel, or rather, the lack of it. By late 1944, American submarines and aircraft had so thoroughly disrupted Japanese oil supplies that carriers sometimes remained in port not because of battle damage, but because there was no fuel to operate them. Pilots who survived combat often died in training accidents caused by fuel shortages that left them undertrained and unprepared. Aircraft sat on flight decks, fully armed and ready, unable to launch because the tanks were empty. Meanwhile, American carriers operated with a profligacy that seemed almost insulting, aircraft warming up on decks, burning fuel simply to test engines, launching combat air patrols that remained airborne for hours, conducting training exercises during lulls in combat. The Avenger required tremendous amounts of fuel. Its cyclone engine consumed aviation gasoline at a rate that Japanese logistics officers found incomprehensible. A single Avenger on a combat mission might burn more fuel than a Japanese fighter squadron would see in a week. Yet the Americans never seemed to run short. Their oilers accompanied the carrier task forces, refueling ships at sea, maintaining operational tempo, ensuring that aircraft could fly and ships could steam regardless of distance from friendly ports. This was logistics as warfare, supply chains as weapons, the unglamorous machinery of industrial war that Japan could not match. When Avengers attacked Japanese shipping in the final months of the war, they carried more than torpedoes and bombs, they carried the message of American industrial supremacy. Each aircraft represented tens of thousands of man-hours of labor, tons of aluminum and steel, gallons of fuel, the coordinated output of factories and mines and refineries scattered across a continent. The pilot who flew it had been trained at facilities in Texas or Florida, had practiced on aircraft that were then assigned to training squadrons, had learned navigation using systems that Japanese pilots could only dream of. The torpedo he dropped had been manufactured in facilities that produced them by the thousands, tested and refined and improved based on after-action reports from previous missions. Japanese commanders, reading reports of Avenger attacks in the Philippines, at Okinawa, in the waters around the home islands, recognized that they were fighting not just aircraft but an entire system, political, economic, industrial, technological, that had been optimized for large-scale warfare. American democracy, which Japanese militarists had dismissed as weak and decadent, had proven capable of mobilizing resources and coordinating production on a scale that authoritarian Japan could not match. The irony was profound and bitter. The ideology that promised Japanese superiority had blinded its adherents to their material inferiority. By August 1945, when the war ended in nuclear fire and surrender, Japanese naval aviation had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The carriers that survived were in port, fuelless and aircraftless. The pilots who remained alive were undertrained novices or broken veterans. The industrial base that might have rebuilt the force had been bombed into rubble. The Avenger and aircraft, like it unglamorous, brutally effective weapons of industrial war, had done their work. In the years after the war, Japanese veterans who had faced American carrier aircraft spoke of their experiences with a mixture of respect and incomprehension. They had been taught that spirit would overcome matter, that Japanese pilots were inherently superior to their American counterparts, that victory was a matter of will and courage. The Battle of the Philippine Sea and countless engagements before and after had demonstrated the emptiness of those teachings. American pilots were not inferior. American aircraft were not flawed. American tactics were not primitive. The entire framework of assumptions that had sent Japan to war proved false when tested against reality. The Avenger, in this narrative, becomes a symbol of American pragmatism, a machine designed to perform a specific function efficiently, built in quantities that reflected industrial capacity rather than ideological purity, operated by crews who had been trained systematically rather than mystically, supported by logistics that treated warfare as a solvable engineering problem. It was not beautiful. It was not inspiring. It did not embody any transcendent principle beyond the principle that sufficient force, properly applied, achieves desired outcomes. This was the lesson that Japanese pilots learned in the sky above the Philippine Sea and in 100 other battles across the Pacific, that modernity had rendered certain kinds of traditional martial values obsolete, that industrial capacity was itself a form of power that could not be overcome by spiritual strength alone, that wars between industrialized nations would be won by whoever could produce more, faster, better. Japan had entered the war, believing that its pilots were worth 10 Americans each. By the war's end, that calculation had reversed. American industrial might meant that for every Japanese pilot, American could field 10 aircraft, 10 pilots, 10 sets of support equipment, 10 times the ammunition and fuel and replacement parts. The shock that Japanese pilots experienced when Avengers torpedoed their fleet in minutes was not merely tactical surprise. It was the shock of encountering a form of warfare for which their training and tradition had not prepared them, a kind of combat that rendered individual courage and skill less relevant than systemic efficiency and productive capacity. They had expected a test of warrior spirit. They received an industrial process that converted raw materials into enemy casualties with assembly line regularity. In the decades after the war, historians would analyze the Pacific Campaign through many lenses: strategy, tactics, technology, leadership. But perhaps the most fundamental factor was one that Japanese planners had fatally underestimated in 1941, the productive capacity of the American economy when fully mobilized for war. The Avenger was just one product of that mobilization, one weapon among thousands, but it carried within its aluminum airframe the seed of Japan's defeat, the understanding that wars in the industrial age would be won not on battlefields but in factories, not through sacrifice but through production, not by warriors but by welders and assembly line workers, and the unglamorous machinery of modern logistics. The pilots who flew the Avengers were not supermen. The aircraft itself was not revolutionary, but the system that produced them, the economic, political, and industrial apparatus of American democracy at war, proved more powerful than Japanese militarism had imagined possible. This was the transformation that the Battle of the Philippine Sea represented. The moment when Japanese forces encountered the full weight of American industrial power and realized, too late, that they were fighting an enemy who could absorb losses that would cripple Japan and return stronger, who could lose battles and still win wars, who could afford to build aircraft that were excessive and wasteful, because excess and waste were luxuries that abundance made possible. The torpedo that struck Taiho that afternoon, whether it came from Albacore or from some other American submarine, carried more than explosives. It carried the message that Japan's strategic calculations had been wrong from the beginning, that the soft, decadent West possessed a hardness born of industrial power, that American democracy could fight and win total wars against authoritarian regimes precisely because democratic systems, for all their apparent inefficiencies, could mobilize and sustain efforts that authoritarian systems could not match. This is the larger truth that the Battle of the Philippine Sea illuminates, that in modern warfare, abundance is its own form of strength, that logistics can decide outcomes more surely than tactics, that the nation which commands superior resources and knows how to employ them systematically will, in the end, prevail over adversaries who rely on courage and spirit alone. The Avenger, blunt and unglamorous, represented this truth in aluminum and steel. Japanese pilots, trained to believe in their own superiority, encountered that truth in the sky above the Philippine Sea and learned, in minutes of terror and confusion, that they had been fighting a war they could not win against an enemy whose true strength had been obscured by distance and ideology, until it was far too late to change course. The ocean that morning had been blue and calm. By evening it was littered with wreckage and oil slicks and the bodies of men who had believed themselves invincible. The Avengers that landed back on American carriers that night had done their work quietly, efficiently, without drama or glory. Their crews ate dinner, slept, and prepared for the next day's missions. The carriers steamed on, their decks busy with activity, their fuel tanks full, their magazines stocked, their replacement aircraft already in the pipelines stretching back to factories in New York and Michigan and California. This was the face of American power in 1944. Not a face at all, really, but a system, a process, a method of converting industrial capacity into victory through the application of overwhelming force applied persistently over time. The Japanese pilots who survived to see it understood, finally, what they were fighting. But understanding came too late, after the carriers were sunk, after the aircraft were destroyed, after the illusions of superiority had been burned away by the hard light of defeat. The war would continue for another year, through desperate kamikaze attacks and island-hopping campaigns and the atomic fires of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the essential outcome had been decided in battles like the Philippine Sea, where Japanese forces confronted the reality that American abundance, properly organized and applied, was a weapon against which courage and tradition offered no defense. The Avengers that torpedoed the Japanese fleet that morning were not miracle weapons. They were simply products of a system that produced such weapons by the thousands, operated them with systematic competence, replaced them when they were lost, and improved them based on experience. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. Overwhelmingly enough. The shock that Japanese pilots experienced was the shock of recognition, the understanding that they had been fighting not just American aircraft but American factories, not just American pilots but American industrial civilization, and that the outcome of such a contest had never truly been in doubt once the United States decided to fight. The battle was over in minutes. The war had been over before it began, though only one side had known it.